So what is it like to be a scholar that really believes in searching for the truth, but yet you're in a state that really makes it difficult?
When you're fighting radical Islam, the focus has always been on jihad or violent terror. Well, that freedom of speech, actually, it's kind of rude. Let's just let it go. It's interesting for me to see how easy it is for those who've inherited freedoms and prosperity to let go of those things.
And it's manifesting itself because of this interconnectedness of globalization and the internet.
This idea that America is rotten to the core, that we are a systemically racist country, that we have to correct for that, and that the only way to do it is to destroy America as we know it.
Welcome back to episode 6 of Generally Speaking. Today it's my great honor to have Ayaan Hirsi Ali as a guest, and we're going to talk to her about her book, her life, what it's like living in the United States, where she thinks things are going, and I'm so excited. I really appreciated your comments. I'm going to continue to respond to those. I think we have a great dialogue going, and this is going to be another one. So, Ayaan, thank you for joining us. You're a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, at the Hoover Institute, sorry. Research fellow at the Hoover Institute, and but most importantly, you're a founder and board member of the AHA Foundation. And I just thought I'd give you an opportunity to talk about what AHA does and its importance.
So the AHA Foundation is focused on trying to eradicate female genital mutilation, honor violence against women, and child marriage here in the United States. And my pitch is to anyone who's listening, please go online and contribute if you care about these issues. Thanks for that, Richard.
So the first time we met was at the White House, and you had come to talk about the challenge of dawah. Could you just, in your words, give a short summary of the message that you were trying to give to the White House when you went, and I think this was like summer of 2017.
Yes, and I stopped very briefly at the White House, but I gave the presentation at the National Security Council. And yeah, I mean, dawah is, let me put it this way, when you're fighting radical Islam, and we've been fighting radical Islam for a very long time here in the United States, the focus has always been on jihad or violent terror. But in fact, to get there and to persuade hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to support terrorist attacks or to support the idea of jihad, you deploy dawah. And dawah is that process of proselytization, of trying to convince people through the mechanism of religion that we have enemies such as infidels, the state of America, the state of Israel, and then to get sometimes, and it's becoming more frequent, to get young people to act on that, to act on the things that they've been taught, and to develop that hostility, and then even go beyond that to the extreme and engage in violence.
So this is something that you, in particular, are very familiar with, and I read your book, and I thought it was just a tremendous profile of courage. I want to take you back. There was a date that you mentioned in the book, July 24th, 1992. Do you still celebrate that date? And can you tell the audience kind of what the significance of that date is?
So for me, I would say if I think back on my life story and reflect on that date, and yes, I do celebrate it every year. And when I say celebrate it, it's really more of an expression of gratitude. I'm really grateful that I took that step and all the good things that happened to me afterwards. But you can look at my life story described in Infidel as, just taking the trip from where I was born in Somalia and going through these different countries in Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and coming to the Netherlands and eventually to the United States. But you can also look at it as an intellectual journey, as a mental journey, where I had to, I found that I had to rescind the moral framework within which I was raised. And then I've come eventually to adopt, again, via Europe, the American principles of freedom and of equality, prosperity. And so if you want me to give you a summary of infidel, that's how I would how I would describe it, not just the physical, but the mental journey.
Yeah, and I could definitely tell, you know, the struggle that you had to kind of, and I think that's a really courageous thing to do, to break out of the mindset that's been built for you throughout your life and really chart a new path all by yourself. So it was in many ways, I think for you, the way I interpreted it was July 24th was a declaration, your declaration of independence, and that you were going to seek your own way in the world. And you wrote an article called, you know, titled, and usually I know how these go. The editor usually picks the title for you, so I don't know if you picked the title, but it said basically that America doesn't need another revolution. And you know, when I read that and I kind of thought of your own Declaration of Independence, it's very closely tied, you know, to although I don't think you probably made that connection, our Declaration of Independence in the United States, because in a way, we as a people were declaring independence from what was a colonial system. So, you know, can you like comment on that? How closely your Declaration of Independence is tied to the way the society you live in now, and the importance that you place on trying to preserve that that independence?
Yeah. So for me, July 24, 1992, symbolizes having to leave my parents and the religion within which they raised me, and the community and the society that I grew up in, and the principles that I was taught to respect and abide by. So I left all of that, and obviously by doing that, I provoked the anger of my father and my family. And you're absolutely right. The Declaration of Independence of the United States is from a colonial system, and it's a completely different order of magnitude. But again, you could say, you know, the desire for individual freedom and individual independence, individual autonomy, is, you know, there are parallels between that desire for individual autonomy and that of a society breaking away from a colonial power and seeking societal independence and nationhood and achieving that. And I think that America made literally a fantastic, just a project, it's been really a fantastic success. And so full admiration for the American Declaration of Independence and things that have come afterwards. But on an individual level, obviously, we're talking about something really, really different.
Yes, and I remember, so the article you wrote was really talking about how, you know, I think from your words, people in the United States, a lot of them, particularly younger people, don't recognize how different our society is from other societies out there. And in particular, I remember one part of Infidel where you're talking about being in this Dutch setting where there was things being debated with regard to Islam. You know, is Islam violent? Is it not violent? And you stood up and you gave your opinion, and it, you know, your sense of being in a society where it was okay to voice, you know, your feelings, and you didn't have to worry about being told to be quiet in Dutch society.
Except I was, in the end, you know,
right,
to self-censor and so on. But again, to go back, you know, when America liberated itself from British rule, about 244, 245 years ago, things were really different. There was, I mean, and I remember reading about how religious freedom and the freedom of conscience and the freedom of speech were regarded as very important. And it's one of the, that First Amendment is something that Americans then really got into trying to establish and achieve. And the generations that worked hard to do that obviously value it way more than the generations that inherited those values and inherited the prosperity and inherited all these various kinds of freedoms. And so the challenge now is for those who inherited it, who don't know what it is to struggle for things because they've never had to struggle for things. It's for those generations now to continue to pass it on to the next and the next and the next generation. And in Europe, before 1989, and I wasn't in Europe before 1989, but if you looked at the conversations they were having and the things that they were writing about, these freedoms meant something to them because of the Cold War. After 1989, I mean, in a decade or so, we started to sink into moral relativism. We started to sink into, a mental and intellectual discourse where we were saying, well, that freedom of speech, actually, it's kind of rude. Why? Let's just let it go. Talking about Islam and criticizing Islam, Salman Rushdie being threatened, other Muslims and ex-Muslims being threatened, that was presented as, of course, they have the right to say these things. Of course, Salman has a right to write his book, but he shouldn't provoke. Why provoke? And unfortunately, that sentiment has now made its way to America. So it's interesting for me to see how easy it is for those who've inherited freedoms and prosperity to let go of those things.
Right, and it's interesting in your book, you talk about moving from place to place and the increasing use of the hijab and other, you see other manifestations of Islam kind of spreading as you move from place to place. And I remember a portion of the book where you're talking about, they sent a reporter back to kind of dig up dirt for a story about you. And I think it was Kenya where you saw a video of Kenya and your brother was back there and you noticed people walking on the street with a lot more, wearing, the hijab. And so you've seen this spread of this ideology which restricts freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and actually is very much like the cancel culture that's growing up here in the United States. When you now look back on your time moving from Kenya to the Netherlands and then moving to the United States, how has Europe changed over that time? And then how do you think the United States has changed, really, since I think the first time you were here was 2008, is that right?
2006. So the first time I came here was 2002, but that was very brief. And then I kept coming back, but I actually moved here permanently in 2006, September of 2006. So, I mean, I saw this what was in the early days gradual, but later on it seemed to go with a frightening pace, a frightening speed. But I left Somalia in the 1970s, and I don't remember women covered from head to toe. I don't remember I knew that everybody was a Muslim, or I thought of everyone as a Muslim, but I don't remember any kind of specific religious fundamentalism. And I could see that contrast because when we left Somalia and went to Saudi Arabia, my God, that was a different country. Yes, the women were walking in black garb from head to toe, wearing gloves and socks and separated from the men, and all this over, 98 degrees, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So that was quite something. There were every few feet, there was a mosque. There was a lot of religious expression, and not just expression, but a lot of religious imposition and oppression. The atmosphere felt oppressive. And it's one of the things that I'm really most grateful for, that my family were deported from Saudi Arabia before I went into puberty. And then we went to Ethiopia, and there again I saw that the people might be religious, but it was very much more relaxed if you take that standard of Saudi Arabia. And in Kenya, even more relaxed, because most Kenyans around me at that time were Christians, not Muslim. There were some Muslims, and I remember my mother going to school and demanding that I wear the headscarf and a pair of trousers under my school uniform. And the teacher in my primary school, what you guys call elementary school, refused to do so and said, here are the rules. We have a school uniform, you abide by that. And my mother just went away feeling sad and disappointed, but no, luckily didn't pull me out. Fast forward, when this documentary is made in 2006 and the camera crew from the Netherlands go off to Kenya to investigate my family life, I was just shocked. Yes, you're absolutely right. Stunned to see how the streets of Kenya had changed. They visited both of the schools that I went to, the elementary school and the high school. And now, instead of the odd girl wearing a headscarf or none, I would say most of them were wearing a headscarf. So I remember just looking at that visual and thinking, that has just only happened in 10 years. That's just in one decade. And then same thing in Europe, the Muslim communities, the Muslim minorities in Europe were very much, at least to me, it looked like in the early days, they were attempting to assimilate. And yes, I did see women walking about a foot behind their husband, 3 feet behind their husbands and pushing baby prams. But in a decade, again, that community has changed dramatically. Now you go to those neighborhoods and it's not just the married women with the children who are covered from head to toe. There are more and more women. And it becomes stifling because you can't really get out of it. You probably don't want to wear the hijab or the burqa, but others will come to you and enforce it. And then the women who don't want and the families who don't want, they get out of these neighborhoods. And so in Europe, what you see is this establishment of Muslim majority ghettos where Sharia law is informally enforced. And that, again, is a product of da'wah, which is the presentation I gave to you and your colleagues in 2017.
So what I have been focused on, when most of my colleagues after 9/11 went to the Middle East, I was selected to be a scholar in China. So I lived in Shanghai for 2 years, learned Chinese at the Defense Language Institute, and really got to know China very well. So I wasn't involved too much in the Middle East. As an Air Force officer, I was very much involved in China. And so this has kind of been my focus. But so last time on this show, we talked to Helen Pluckrose. I think you probably know Helen and James Lindsay. They wrote a book called Cynical Theories. And what I started to work on in 2014 was this very similar process that was going on, not just kind of the way you were seeing it in ghettos in Europe, but in our major corporations, in Wall Street and in Washington, D.C., where our politicians, and in fact, we just had a report that said that, some 2 million Chinese Communist Party members are, all over, corporations, financial institutions. They're, of course, entrapping politicians in these kind of sexual escapades we just saw with Eric Swalwell. So, when I listen to you, when I read your stuff, I see the same kind of enculturation going on, but going on in a very much, more of a financial incentive environment. And it's all leading to a very similar world, which is one where you have self-censorship. Of course, if you say anything about the Chinese Communist Party, you can be fired. In fact, often corporations do that on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. And so it just seems like there's this perfect storm between what you've seen in your life growing up and what I'm witnessing coming from China, and it's manifesting itself because of this interconnectedness of globalization and the internet. Now, you've been at the Hoover Institute for a while. What's your thoughts about how do we correct for this? How do we protect our society from embracing these things or totally counter to our principles and values. And what are the things that you think? Does the Hoover Institute work on this? I know they've got an effort on China, but they've also been very, very close to the Chinese Communist Party. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on how we break free of this.
So I'm not sure I know of any kind of closeness between the Hoover Institution and the Chinese Communist Party. And I know I have some colleagues who would be really valuable to you in talking about their thoughts on China, their criticism on China. I do sometimes, sit in on these meetings and listen to all the terrifying things that China is up to and including the internment now that no one wants to talk about, not even Muslim countries, of the Uyghur peoples, 10 million people, and what they're doing there is just horrifying. So I do see China as a threat, and them trying to get themselves mixed up in our elections, obviously blackmailing people, cybersecurity. I just like any other consumer of the news, I hear about these things, but I have no specialist understanding of it. In terms of cynical theories and the work that Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay have done, that is an ideology that is actually homegrown. It's not from any, it's not from the outside. It's not some other country trying to impose these things on us. And so in the years that I was discussing radical Islam and what they're trying to achieve here, trying to indoctrinate our citizens, trying to establish themselves as an insurrection force, as an insurgency, through da'wah, and I try to draw attention to the fact that, in fact, da'wah is way more dangerous than jihad, because, when you have a terrorist act, it is clear, it's for everyone to see, and law enforcement and the military and other security forces go after that kind of threat. But the ideological threat, that was, as far as radical Islam is concerned, it came from the outside to the inside. When it comes to what is now, that goes by the name of woke, that is from the inside. That is born and raised in our own universities. It's our own professors and administrators who are indoctrinating students at the college level. And now that has actually gone down to high school and even farther down. But it has also spread to, as James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose show, it has also spread to the administrative state. And it's just this idea that America is rotten to the core, that we are a systemically racist country, that we have to correct for that, and that the only way to do it is to destroy America as we know it. And James makes it very clear, because a lot of people say it's Marxist. And Helen and James say, no, it's not. It's neo-Marxist. It's something worse than that, because the Marxists were after some kind of material, fixing of the injustices that they saw. But what we are seeing now is it's a nihilistic ideology. It really is out there to destroy relationships between people, between races, between the genders, between all sorts of other groups that they've invented. And the solutions that they're proposing is complete destruction. And that's expressed in slogans such as defund the police, close up the prisons, pay reparations. So if you go to the Black Lives Matter website and you see what they're demanding, what their demands are, if any of that was in fact implemented, that would be the end of the American project. And so I think it would be very important to make that distinction between threats that are coming from the outside, which in some ways are easier to understand, from the threats that are coming from the inside. And this ideological woke religion, quasi-religion, seems now to have frightened enough people to be quiet and not to push back against it.
Well, that's good news. So when I meant by saying Hoover Institute had a relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, I meant that I've been a participant in programs between the Hoover Institute and China, and everything in China is run by the Chinese Communist Party. So I'll just make that clarification of my point. I think that
an institution that's engaged in sort of a geopolitical understanding of the world will have to have relationships with countries, including China, that are run by dictatorial governments. So I think I just want to point that out. It's not like we're colluding with China to destroy America. I think we are trying to understand China and infiltrate China as much as they are trying to understand us and infiltrate us.
Well, I just think that one of the things that I found here in the United States is an inability by China scholars to differentiate between what is the Chinese Communist Party and what is China and what are the Chinese people. So, I think that for me, I recognize that there's a distinction between wokeism, which isn't domestic, between radical Islam or Islam as it in its current form, and the Chinese Communist Party, the oppression that they try to push, and certainly the influence they try to push. But in many ways, they share a lot of the same characteristics. This idea of self-censorship, this idea of more totalitarian belief than valuing individual freedom. So when I look at these systems arraying around the world, I see the rise of totalitarianism, and yet when you listen to the China scholars, they'll say it's not ideological. But I really believe it is ideological, and I think when I read your writing, when I read Helen Pluckrone's writing, when I read, things that I have written about the Chinese Communist Party, they all share elements of the same thing, and I think understanding.
You go in there and say where there is ideological totalitarianism, there's also a very strong anti-Americanism, because the idea of America is antithetical to the idea of any totalitarian or collectivist ideology. So I can see precisely why it would be strategic and advantageous to a country that doesn't like America, or an ideological regime that doesn't like America, like Iran, Chinese Communist Party, some of the Sunni radical groups, why they would take advantage of and exploit woke ideology and what it's doing to us from the inside. I can completely see that. I can see why they can say, well, here are the weak points of America. Here's where we can get to them. And that is absolutely very clear. So that much I can see, and Helen and James see it, and any intelligent person can see that. And in fact, any intelligent totalitarian regime would do exactly that. But I think the attitude to take to this is not to be conspiratorial, but to be realistic about it.
Of course, it makes sense for them to do it because it is in their own interest to make America weak, to make us divided, to have us fighting amongst ourselves. So I agree with that. So I have to ask you, though, I was born pretty close to where you live today. I grew up my entire, young adult to my young adult life in California. I haven't been there for a long time because I joined the Air Force and went around the world. But you are in the capital of wokeism. So what is it like to be a scholar that really, believes in, searching for the truth, but yet you're in a state that really makes it difficult?
Well, I think what's happening now with our state, California, is that it's run so poorly. We have wildfires. We have the mentally ill living on the streets, large numbers of homeless people. We have housing that you can't afford if you're in the middle class. We have all sorts of problems. And what I'm seeing right now, and I don't know if that's, and then we have also politicians when they come together who seem to be preoccupied with pronouns more than they're preoccupied with the big problems that we face. And so what we're seeing is some of our larger corporations are leaving. There's an exodus out of California of these large companies. Elon Musk is taking his company away. Oracle is leaving. Hewlett Packard has left. And on it goes. And maybe, who knows, maybe our politicians will come round to doing actual work instead of going off on this tangential about the woke stuff. So we'll see.
Do you find it stifling? Just having, I spent, I got my PhD back in 2000, I think 2007, in economics. But I did find academia, which is supposed to be this open environment to challenge other ideas, I found it stifling because there was only one kind of way of thinking.
So if you take wokeism, they have this whole thing about race. They focus on race, gender, and other subsets of our population, and they see them all as standing, feuding with one another, and they can only have a relationship of power. But because as a Black woman, where I am in that intersectional matrix that they have put together, I seem to have less problem than, say, the white heterosexual male. People may not like what I say, they may not like what I write about, but so far I've not had any kind of hostility towards me, the kind that I'm used to, say, from Muslim minorities. So, when I was cancelled from Brandeis, that initiative was organized by the Muslim Student Association on the grounds that I was blaspheming, that I had said terrible things about Islam and Muslim people. And that kind of stuck. But I don't see how, someone like Robin DiAngelo, who the author of White Fragility, can come after me because she's boxed herself in. She can only go after white men. She can't come after me.
Well, so I mean, then that it actually provides a benefit to know you, because then I can phone a friend and say, hey, can I call my friend Ayaan, because she says the same thing that I do. So you can become my protector, basically, because I'm totally the wrong.
You can say something that is totally commonsensical and be punished for it and be cancelled for it, and you can have someone else, a Black man, a Black woman, someone who's gay, transgender, say the exact same, make the exact same point, and that can even be welcome, and you could even get applauded for it, but not you. I'm sorry.
Right, I'm canceled. So Ayaan, do you still have concerns for your safety? Do you still find that you have to have security and everything? I found that to be very sad, that you had to deal with that.
Well, unfortunately, where radical Islam is, and it's not, that problem is not out of the world. As long as that's there, yes, I have to take great care for my security. And you've seen, I don't know if you've been following the developments in France, in Austria,
right,
other parts of Europe. As long as these individuals think that, their path to salvation is by killing the blasphemers and the heretics of Islam and the infidels and the Jews and all the groups of people that they've designated as their enemies, we have to be very, very careful for our security.
Do you see Europe beginning to address this? I mean, it's been a long time since you had to leave the Netherlands because of all that took place. Has there been any change with regard to, allowing this type of behavior in Europe? So,
I mean, I can see that someone like President Macron of France is now saying we need to address Islamist separatism. Actually, he calls it Islamic. He doesn't even go down the Islamist path. And then he has a bill prepared that is doing, the exact same thing that my Dawah book, my Dawah presentation recommended. But years and years later, and after so many people have died, and of course, he is terrified that he's going to lose the election to Marine Le Pen and the Le Pen party, the Front National. So I think that in places like France, things are changing. Because of the scale and the scope and the severity of the Islamist problem. Places like the Netherlands, to a certain degree, the UK, Spain, I think they've put a lot of effort into trying to track them down, going down the path of spying on them and trying to prevent terrorist acts from occurring in the first place, except obviously with the lone wolves, which is very difficult to get to. But I don't see those countries. I've seen and read a fantastic report produced by the security people in the Netherlands on Dawa. But I haven't seen any kind of action then on the cultural level that attempts to stop that, to stop the Dawa activities. But it's happening in France. Once it happens in France, let's say France is really successful in trying to address these Dawa activities and bring them to a halt and provide French Muslims an alternative, then that could be sort of like, okay, that's a pilot project, or it's a successful project. Then the other countries can adopt and copy. I remain optimistic. It's one thing I've learned about Americans.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you're optimistic. So one of the things that Rich and I agreed on, and I was focused on China, Rich was focused more on Rich Higgins, that is. He was the director for strategy in the first year at the Trump administration.
I wanted to say, Rob, in the beginning of this, I just said Richard, but I was thinking of Richard, so.
That's okay. That's okay. So Rich, the things that we agreed on was this idea of control of the narrative of, essentially, rather than thinking of the traditional way that we had gone to war with terrorism, was to focus on the ideological and certainly the political aspects and the social aspects of it, and so he was very much focused on getting the Trump administration to look at the problem differently, as was I with regard to China. Now, as you see the outcomes of the election in November, I don't know what your opinion of how the election was carried out. Certainly was different than any other election we've had here in the last several decades. But in essence, it would look like if the election is allowed to, if Biden is inaugurated, then you're going to see an end to kind of focusing on these problems in ways that you've advocated, that Rich advocated, that I've advocated. How do you see this playing out? What's your sense of what happened in November? What happened in 2020 with regard to coronavirus? Because we know that the Communist Party enabled the spread of the pandemic and really sought to benefit from it and had an influence campaign that was essentially related to it. How do you see this going forward? Because I see a big threat for democracy.
Well, again, I just have to put it out there. I don't really know much about China and Chinese activities inside the United States. Like, like the general public, I read about stuff. But I have no insight into exactly what is happening and what that means for us and what that means for them. But in terms of the Islamists, because that's really what I know something about, I will say in the run-up to the election, there was that moment that back then candidate Biden was made to say things. I mean, these things came out of his mouth, and I was listening to it, and I thought, my God, he's commanding right and forbidding wrong. And that is part of, it's an element, a very strong element in Dawa, in the Dawa space, where I'm going to paraphrase what he said, but he said, I'll have to ask Alex to find it and send it to you. But it struck me as, okay, here we have someone who really doesn't understand what he just said and what he's been asked to say, probably in exchange for votes, because the Muslim Brotherhood members, like the Council of American Islamic Relations, was saying we can mobilize 1 million people to vote for the Democrats, but what are they going to get in exchange for that? And just listening to Biden, I don't know what is happening in the back rooms of the campaign, but just listening to what he said on television, I remember thinking, we need to get to him very, very quickly. Now, I heard something. I don't know if his campaign saw it. I don't know if they're going to do it or not do it. I've seen in my years in politics that people say things in public, but then they make other strategic plans.
They don't do it.
They don't do it. Yeah. So I mean, having said all of that, though, I have to say to you that that was shocking, and of course very concerning.
So, I mean, do you have a concern? I know I'm concerned about the outcome of the election. Is that something that you've paid any attention to, or you just kind of read about it in the news? What's your sense of, what's gone on here? Because, I mean, it seems like there's a large portion of our society that doesn't see it as a legitimate election. And what does that mean for America?
So I'm not part of the group who are saying this is not a legitimate election, but I can say the election outcome, with the Republicans holding on to the Senate and the Democrats taking the Oval Office, I think one thing that makes me optimistic is they'll be forced to work together. The second thing is all the things that we were, as I would say, upstanding Americans, we were really terrified of by the radical socialist wing of the Democratic Party, packing the courts and adding 2 states to the union and defunding the police and all that. That's not going to happen with a Republican Senate. And so, again, instead of litigating the election of November 3, I would say to the Republicans, focus on Georgia.
I think that's clear. That's a lot of the Republican Party is kind of doing the same thing. So, Ayaan, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. It's been a joy talking to you. I look forward to seeing more writing and speaking coming out of the things that you're doing. I hope the AHA Foundation continues to be successful in promoting, safety and independence and someday freedom for little girls that were like you growing up in Somalia and other places around the world. It is. I'm such a fan of your work. I think you're courageous. You are a modern day warrior, because our modern day fight is really a fight of information, of ideology, of politics, and it's important that we listen to people like you, because it really is foundational to preserving the kind of society we live in here in America. So thank you.
And thank you for your service and your dedication to this country and our society, and taking the time to carry on speaking and writing and doing what you do. So thank you too. Thank you so much for having me.
And please let me know next time you're in DC, and maybe we can share some coffee or something.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much.